Before Rome, before Egypt, before even Babylon, there was Akkad, the world's first empire. A kingdom so powerful, its rulers called themselves the masters of the four corners of the world. A civilization so vast, its language became the language of kings, merchants, and warriors alike. But today, its cities are gone. Its great monuments, buried. Its name, almost forgotten. But who were the Akkadians? And how did they rise from scattered city-states to create the first empire in human history? How did they carve their legacy in stone, only to vanish into dust? This is the story of an orphan who became a king. A king who became an emperor. And an empire that changed history forever. But history is not kind to the mighty. No empire lasts forever. And Akkad was no exception. Its rise was swift, but its fall? Even swifter. So how did the world's first empire come to be? And why did it disappear? Let's go back to the beginning. Before Akkad, there was chaos. Kingdoms walled themselves in, forever at war. But change was coming. It began here, in a land cradled between two mighty rivers. A land so fertile, so rich, that it gave birth to something the world had never seen before, civilization. For thousands of years, humans wandered. They followed the herds, hunted what they could, and moved when the land gave them no choice. But here, between the Tigris and Euphrates, something changed. The rivers flooded, depositing rich, dark soil. Crops flourished. And for the first time, people stayed. This was Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the beating heart of what we now call the Fertile Crescent, the very first spark of civilization. But civilization is more than just farming. It's cities. And the first cities on Earth rose here, their walls towering over the desert, their streets bustling with life. Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Kish, names that, in their time, meant everything. And at the center of it all were the Sumerians, the first true masters of civilization. They weren't just farmers, they were builders, inventors, and thinkers. They harnessed the rivers, digging canals and ditches, controlling the floods that once threatened them. They built massive temples, ziggurats that stretched toward the heavens. And they did something that would change history forever. They wrote. Not with letters, not yet, but with symbols pressed into clay. Cuneiform, the first known writing system. At first, it was just for numbers, keeping track of grain and sheep. But soon, it became something much bigger. Laws. Poems. Prayers to the gods. Even the first recorded stories. For the first time, history was being written down. Also, the Akkadian Empire was not just an army marching across Mesopotamia. It was home to merchants, farmers, artisans, priests, and scribes, millions of people who lived, worked, and thrived under its rule. For them, life did not revolve around conquest, but around the rhythms of daily existence, shaped by the rivers, the gods, and the laws of the land. Food was at the heart of Akkadian society, and like the Sumerians before them, they relied on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to nourish their fields. Their diet was based on barley, which was used for everything, from making bread to brewing beer, the staple drink of the time. In fact, beer was so important that laborers were often paid in rations of bread and beer, rather than silver or goods. Dates were another essential crop, eaten fresh or dried and used as a natural sweetener. Onions, garlic, lentils, and cucumbers were common vegetables, and people supplemented their meals with fish from the rivers. Meat, especially beef and lamb, was available but mostly reserved for the wealthy or for religious offerings. Goat's milk and cheese were also consumed, adding variety to their diet. One of the greatest luxuries was honey, which was expensive and rare, often reserved for the nobility and temple rituals. Spices like coriander and cumin were used to season dishes, showing that Akkadian cuisine, while simple, had a richness of flavor. Clothing in the Akkadian Empire was a symbol of status, with a clear distinction between commoners and the elite. Most people, especially laborers and farmers, wore simple woolen garments wrapped around their bodies, tied with belts. These were usually left bare on one shoulder to allow for greater movement, and during the hot summer months, people often wore short kilts. The wealthier classes, including merchants and officials, wore longer, more elaborate robes, sometimes with fringes or embroidery. They also dyed their fabrics in colors like red, blue, and yellow, dyes that were expensive and signaled status. But it was the elites and the royal family who dressed most extravagantly. Akkadian kings, priests, and nobles adorned themselves with intricate headdresses, golden jewelry, and fine linen robes. Wealthy women often wore elaborate hairstyles, sometimes braided and decorated with beads or precious metals, and they applied makeup, particularly kohl, to darken their eyes, a tradition that would be passed down to later Mesopotamian civilizations. Footwear also reflected wealth. While commoners went barefoot or wore simple sandals, the nobility had shoes made of leather, often decorated with beads or metal accents. But Akkad was not just a military superpower, it was also the center of a massive trade network, connecting distant regions in ways that had never been seen before. The Akkadians expanded commerce beyond Mesopotamia, creating economic links stretching as far as the Indus Valley, modern-day Pakistan and India, Anatolia, Turkey, and even the Persian Gulf. Caravans carried Akkadian goods, textiles, wool, and grain to distant lands. In return, merchants brought back lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Oman, silver from Anatolia, and exotic woods from the Levant. Akkadian records mention ships sailing from the Persian Gulf, loaded with foreign goods, suggesting that they engaged in long-distance maritime trade, possibly even reaching the ancient civilizations of the Arabian Peninsula. Markets in Akkadian cities were bustling centers of commerce, where traders haggled over prices and scribes recorded transactions on clay tablets. Cuneiform contracts and receipts have been found detailing everything from the sale of donkeys to land purchases, showing a sophisticated economic system where law and commerce went hand in hand. Akkadian rulers also standardized weights and measures, ensuring fair trade across the empire. This level of economic control laid the foundation for later empires like Babylon, which would continue and expand upon these trade networks. However, women in Mesopotamia had long held a variety of roles in society, and under Akkadian rule, their legal and economic status both advanced and became more restricted in different ways. One major difference was property rights. Under Akkadian law, women were allowed to own land, run businesses, and inherit property from their families, something that was rare in other ancient societies. Wealthy women could be merchants, landowners, or priestesses in temples dedicated to gods like Inanna. Some even had the power to sign contracts and participate in legal disputes, a privilege not available to all women in later Mesopotamian periods. However, Akkadian law also reinforced strict social hierarchies, particularly in marriage and family life. Women's roles became more confined to domestic and religious spheres, and many legal codes emphasized a woman's duty to her husband and family above all else. Arranged marriages were common, and divorce was difficult, though not impossible. If a woman was abandoned or mistreated, she could appeal to temple officials or royal courts. At the highest levels of society, queens and priestesses wielded considerable influence. Some Akkadian royal women acted as high priestesses of important temples, controlling vast amounts of land and wealth. Others, like Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon, became famous for their writings. Enheduanna, a high priestess of the moon god Nanna, is the earliest known author in history, composing hymns and poetry that survive to this day. So while Akkadian women had more legal rights than women in many later civilizations, their freedoms were also shaped by social class, wealth, and religious roles. For most Akkadians, life was dictated by work, religion, and the cycle of the seasons. Farmers rose before dawn to tend their fields, using irrigation canals to water their crops. Artisans spent their days crafting pottery, metal tools, and intricate jewelry. Traders journeyed along dusty roads, carrying goods across the empire. At the heart of every city was the ziggurat, the massive step temple that dominated the skyline. Religion was woven into every aspect of daily life. People prayed for good harvests, sought protection from the gods, and made offerings to ensure divine favor. festivals dedicated to deities like Ishtar, Inanna, Enlil, and Shamash brought communities together in celebration. Home life was structured around large, extended families, with multiple generations living together under one roof. Fathers held authority, but mothers played crucial roles in managing the household. Children were taught family trades, and if a boy was lucky enough to come from a wealthy family, he might study with scribes and learn the art of writing cuneiform, a skill that could elevate him to a powerful position in government or temple administration. For entertainment, Akkadians enjoyed music, storytelling, and games. Archaeologists have uncovered board games similar to the later royal game of War, suggesting that even in the heart of an empire, people found ways to relax and enjoy life. But the Sumerians had a problem. Their cities, their inventions, their wealth, it all made them powerful. And power always invites conflict. Imagine a world where every city is its own kingdom. Where your neighbor isn't your ally, but your greatest enemy. In Mesopotamia, cities weren't just places to live. They were fortresses, walled and guarded, ruled by kings who saw themselves as chosen by the gods. Uruk, Lagash, Kish, and dozens more, each fighting for dominance. The title of Lugal, meaning Great King, was more than just a name. It was a challenge. Whoever held it was expected to prove their strength, not just in ruling, but in war. For centuries, these cities battled for land, for water, for power. One king would rise, claiming to rule over all of Sumer, only to be overthrown by another. Alliances were made, and just as quickly, broken. And behind every battle was something more than just ambition. The gods. To the Sumerians, every city belonged to a god. Ur was the home of Nanna, the moon god. Uruk belonged to Inanna, goddess of love and war. The kings were merely stewards, ruling on behalf of the divine. And so, when one city conquered another, it wasn't just a political victory, it was proof that their god was stronger. But this constant warfare took its toll. The cities were rich, but exhausted. Strong, but vulnerable. A greater force could have conquered them all. A single ruler, a man strong enough to unite them, could have ended the cycle of war. But no such man existed. Not yet. Or so they thought. What if I told you some kings ruled for 1,000 years? 5,000? 10,000? This isn't myth. At least, not entirely. It's written history, on a document known as the Sumerian King List. This ancient record lists every ruler of Mesopotamia, stretching back thousands of years before Akkad. Some ruled for decades. Others? For millennia. One name stands out, Alulim, king of Eridu. According to the list, he ruled for 28,800 years. Impossible, of course. But what if the truth was buried somewhere inside the myth? Many historians believe these impossible reigns aren't meant to be taken literally. Instead, they represent something else, perhaps a time before written history, when rulers were remembered as more than just men, but as legends. But there's something else hidden in the king list. A pattern. Again and again, it describes a great ruler rising, only for disaster to follow. Wars. Floods. The gods themselves seemingly punishing humanity. Perhaps it was a warning, one that the Akkadians failed to heed. Because soon, one name would be added to this list. A name that was not a god, nor a myth. A man whose reign would reshape history itself. For centuries, these city-states fought one another. No single ruler could unite them, until a child, abandoned in a river, rose to power. History does not remember the weak. Sargon knew this. He was no king by birth, but he would become one. A man can be born into power. Or he can take it. Sargon was neither a prince nor a noble. He was an orphan. A servant. A man who should have been forgotten by history. Instead, he became its first great conqueror. The origins of Sargon of Akkad are shrouded in legend. He left behind no autobiography, no words of his own, only stories told by others, passed down through centuries. And the most famous of them all? The story of the basket and the river. According to an ancient text, Sargon was born to a high priestess, a woman forbidden from having children. To hide her shame, she placed her newborn son into a woven basket, setting him adrift on the Euphrates River. A baby, abandoned in the currents, helpless, yet destined for greatness. Does the story sound familiar? It should. Centuries later, a Hebrew prophet named Moses would be found the same way. And before him, Rome's founders, Romulus and Remus, were left to die by the Tiber before being raised by a she-wolf. Coincidence? Or was this a tale crafted to give Sargon a divine beginning? The story tells us the basket did not sink. Instead, the river carried the child to safety, where he was found by a humble gardener named Akki. Akki took the boy in, raised him, gave him a name, Sargon, meaning the true king. And yet, despite his name, Sargon was no king. Not yet. He grew up in the city of Kish, working in the palace, not as a noble, but as a cupbearer. This was no ordinary servant's job, it was a position of trust. He stood beside kings, poured their wine. Sargon was watching. Waiting. For his moment. A servant is meant to obey, but Sargon had other plans. At the time, Kish was ruled by King Uarzababa, a powerful man, but a paranoid one. And for good reason. Dreams haunted him, visions of his downfall, of a man who would seize his throne. That man was Sargon. The texts claim that one night, Uarzababa had a dream. The goddess Inanna came to me. She bathed the man in blood, made him stand before me. That man will be king. The king woke in terror. The man in his dream? His cupbearer, Sargon. Uarzababa acted fast. He sent Sargon on a suicide mission, a message to the king of Uruk, telling him to execute the young servant. But fate had other plans. Instead of dying, Sargon did the unthinkable. He overthrew Uruk itself. The details are scarce, but one thing is clear, Sargon took the city by force. Whether through battle, deception, or rebellion, he defeated King Lugal-Zagizi of Uruk, breaking the balance of power that had ruled Mesopotamia for centuries. With Uruk under his control, Kish soon followed. And then, the rest of Sumer's cities turned their eyes to the rising conqueror. Some fought. Some surrendered. But one thing was certain, Sargon would not stop. A warrior wins battles. A king wins wars. But an emperor? He changes the world. Sumer had seen war before. Every city had its army, its walls, its weapons. But Sargon fought differently. Instead of temporary militias, Sargon created the world's first standing army, full-time soldiers, disciplined and deadly. No longer did men fight only when their city was under threat. They fought year-round, marching across Mesopotamia like an unstoppable tide. Also, Sargon understood that victory was more than swords and spears, it was fear. He made an example of those who resisted. Cities that defied him were crushed, their rulers humiliated. The message was clear, submit, or be destroyed. Sargon didn't just claim to be a king. He claimed to be chosen by the gods. He aligned himself with Inanna, Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, claiming she personally granted him the right to rule. His name was no accident, Sargon, the true king. It was a statement to the world. City after city fell. Uar, Lagash, Nippur, one by one, they all bowed to Sargon. Until finally, there was no one left to oppose him. For the first time in history, Sumer was unified, not as a collection of city-states, but as a single kingdom. But Sargon's vision was bigger. Much bigger. He did not just want to rule Sumer. He wanted an empire. Every empire needs a heart. Rome had Rome. Babylon had Babylon. But where was Akkad? We know that Sargon built a capital, a mighty city that bore the name of his people, Akkad. It was said to be the center of the world, a city of power, trade, and ambition. And yet, unlike Uar or Uruk, Akkad has never been found. No ruins. No walls. Only whispers in ancient texts. What we do know is this: Akkad was different. Unlike the old Sumerian cities, which were ruled independently, Akkad was built for an empire. Instead of fragmented rule, Sargon created a centralized government, where power flowed from him alone. For the first time, Mesopotamia had a single capital, a place where laws were made, armies were commanded, and tribute was collected. The old world of squabbling city-states was gone. In its place, Sargon created something new: an empire. But an empire is not just land. It's control. And Sargon knew that ruling by force alone would never last. He needed a system, one that would outlive him. Conquest is easy. Control is hard. Sargon understood this better than anyone. Sumer had always been a land of kings, dozens of them, each ruling their own city, each answering to no one but their god. But Sargon shattered that system. First, instead of allowing local kings to remain in power, he replaced them with Akkadian officials, loyal men who answered only to him. These weren't just governors. They were enforcers of the empire, ensuring that laws, taxes, and military orders were followed without question. Also, Sumerian wars had always been fought by part-time soldiers, farmers, craftsmen, men who picked up weapons only when needed. But Sargon created something different: a full-time, professional military, permanent, trained, and ready for war at any time. Soldiers who owed loyalty not to a city, but to the empire. A force that could be deployed anywhere, crushing rebellion before it even began. It was the first of its kind in history. And it worked. But power wasn't just about force. Sargon knew that an empire needed structure, consistency. So, he did something radical. He standardized weights and measures across all of Mesopotamia, ensuring fair trade. He created a single taxation system, making sure wealth flowed to Akkad. He connected cities with better roads, speeding up the movement of goods, armies, and information. For the first time, Mesopotamia wasn't just a collection of cities. It was one system, one economy, one empire. But Sargon's control wasn't just over land and law. He wanted to shape something deeper, culture itself, because power is not just taken with the sword. It is written in words. For centuries, Sumerian had been the language of kings, merchants, and scribes. But Sargon changed that. He made Akkadian the official language of government, trade, and administration. Over time, cuneiform, the writing system invented by the Sumerians, evolved to fit Akkadian words. This wasn't just about communication. It was about identity. By making Akkadian the dominant language, Sargon ensured that Mesopotamia was no longer just Sumerian. It was Akkadian. And this influence spread far beyond Mesopotamia. To the west, in the Levant, Akkadian became the language of diplomacy. To the east, in Elam, Akkadian merchants brought their scripts and laws. To the north, in Anatolia, kings learned to write in Akkadian, adopting it for their own records. Sargon was not just creating a political empire. He was shaping a cultural empire, one that would last long after his rule ended. But Sargon was more than a king. He was a legend. And legends are hard to separate from truth. But how long does a conqueror rule before he becomes a god? Ancient records claim that Sargon ruled for 55 years, an impossibly long reign for a man who fought so many wars. But was this the truth, or propaganda? Sargon didn't just claim to be king. He claimed to be chosen by Inanna, Ishtar, the goddess of love and war. He credited her for his victories. He built temples in her honor. In return, he expected loyalty, not just from his people, but from the gods themselves. This was not just political. It was psychological warfare. By aligning himself with a powerful goddess, Sargon gave his rule divine legitimacy. To rebel against him was not just treason, it was blasphemy. The idea of Sargon as an invincible, god-backed ruler cemented his control over the empire. Yet, behind the myths, cracks began to show. Not everyone accepted Akkadian rule. Rebellions flared up in the far corners of the empire. City-states tried to break free. Sargon spent much of his later years putting down revolts, proof that not all of Mesopotamia had accepted his rule. So, was he truly invincible? Or was his empire held together only by his iron will? Because even the greatest conquerors must face time. And time is ruthless. Sargon's empire seemed unstoppable. But history has no mercy, and power is never permanent. Trouble was brewing. No empire falls in a day. But all empires fall. Akkad was no exception. Sargon had done the impossible. He had forged the world's first empire, bending city-states, cultures, and kings to his will. But no man rules forever. After an astonishing reign, Sargon of Akkad, warrior, conqueror, emperor, was gone. And with his death, the cracks in his empire began to widen. His sons, Rimesh and Manishtushu, were left with a kingdom that looked invincible on the surface but was rotting underneath. The city-states that had bowed to Sargon's might now saw an opportunity. The moment his iron grip was gone, they rose. Uar, Lagash, and even distant Elam rebelled, each believing it could reclaim its independence. The empire, once held together by Sargon's sheer force of will, was now on the brink of collapse. Rimesh, the first to inherit the throne, faced rebellion on all sides. He crushed his enemies ruthlessly, stamping out revolts with terrifying brutality. Inscription after inscription boasts of how he smashed and annihilated those who defied Akkad. But ruling through fear is a dangerous game. After 9 years, he was assassinated, likely by his own court. His brother Manishtushu took power next, but his reign was just as troubled. More wars, more revolts, more bloodshed. Like his brother, he, too, met a violent end, cut down in an internal coup. Sargon's empire was no longer stable. The cities of Mesopotamia had tasted Akkadian rule for decades, and many had grown to resent it. Akkad had been built on war, and now, war was all it knew. The empire was tearing itself apart. But then came a man who refused to let it fall, Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson. The last great Akkadian Kiev. Sargon was a conqueror, Naram-Sin was something else entirely. He was not just a ruler. He was a god. When he ascended to the throne, the empire was crumbling. His father and uncle had fought desperately to hold it together, and it seemed the world was closing in on Akkad. But Naram-Sin refused to accept decline. He was ruthless, ambitious, and brilliant, perhaps even more so than his legendary grandfather. While others defended, he attacked. Instead of trying to pacify rebels through diplomacy, he crushed them with overwhelming force. He expanded the empire beyond anything Sargon had ever achieved, pushing into the Zagros Mountains, subduing the mighty kingdom of Elam, and marching his armies further than any Mesopotamian had ever gone. But conquest was not enough. Naram-Sin wanted more. He did something no Mesopotamian king had ever dared to do. He declared himself a living god. Before him, kings had always ruled in the name of the gods, acting as their representatives on earth. But Naram-Sin? He was a god. He wore the horned crown, an honor reserved only for the divine, and had his people worship him as the king of the four corners of the world. To his followers, he was unstoppable. To his enemies, he was terrifying. And yet, for all his power, for all his brilliance, he could not control fate. Because Akkad's greatest enemy was not an army. It was something far worse. The records tell of a catastrophe unlike anything before it. The gods, angered by Naram-Sin's arrogance, had cursed Akkad. At least, that's what the ancient scribes believed. Modern science tells a different story. Sometime during Naram-Sin's reign, Mesopotamia was struck by a devastating drought, one that would last for centuries. The rains stopped. The rivers dried. Farmlands withered. And without food, the great cities of Akkad began to starve. Famine spread like wildfire. Hunger bred rebellion, and rebellion bred war. The city-states that had once obeyed Akkad turned against it, driven by desperation. One by one, the outer territories broke away. Naram-Sin, for all his power, could not fight the weather. He could not conquer the sky. the empire that had once ruled the known world was crumbling from within. And then, from the mountains, the final blow came. The Gutians were a people shrouded in mystery. They came from the eastern mountains, wild and untamed. To the Mesopotamians, they were less than human, barbarians, destroyers, demons in human form. For years, the Akkadians had feared them. But now, with the empire weakened, the Gutians saw their chance. They poured down from the mountains in waves, raiding, burning, and pillaging as they went. Akkad's once mighty army was overstretched, exhausted from years of fighting rebellions and famine-driven chaos. It could not stop them. The cities that had once feared Akkad now saw the Gutians as a tool of revenge. Some even joined them, helping them tear down the empire that had ruled them for so long. The final blow came when the Gutians reached Akkad itself. The city that had once been the heart of the world was sacked, looted, and abandoned to history. Its great temples were destroyed. Its palaces were burned. And when the dust settled, Akkad was gone. The empire that Sargon had built, that his descendants had ruled, was no more. The great empire of Akkad was gone. But history never ends, and neither did its influence. Akkad fell. But its shadow stretched far beyond its time. The city of Akkad was reduced to rubble. Its rulers were dead, its monuments destroyed, and its name all but erased from the records of time. But Akkad was not truly gone. Its legacy was carved into the very foundation of the civilizations that followed. Babylon, Assyria, even the mighty Persian Empire, all of them inherited something from Akkad. Sargon had done more than build an empire. He had created the blueprint for empire itself. His centralized administration, his system of provincial governors, his standing army, these were not forgotten. The Babylonians under Hammurabi refined these ideas, using them to craft a legal and political system that would endure for centuries. The Assyrians, with their iron discipline and relentless warfare, perfected Akkad's military strategies, building an empire even larger and more brutal than Sargon's. The Persians, who would one day rule from Egypt to India, took the Akkadian model of governance and expanded it into the largest empire the world had ever seen. And then, of course, there was the language. Akkadian, once the voice of conquerors, became the lingua franca of the ancient Near East. For over 1,000 years after Akkad's fall, kings, merchants, and diplomats still wrote in Akkadian, still used its cuneiform script, still carried forward the voice of a long-dead empire. Even when Akkadian was eventually replaced by Aramaic, it remained the foundation of written communication in Mesopotamia, a legacy that stretched all the way to the time of Alexander the Great. The Akkadian Empire was gone. But the world it had shaped was only just beginning. And yet, for all its influence, Akkad itself is missing. Unlike Babylon, with its famous Ishtar Gate and towering ziggurats, or Ur, with its royal tombs, Akkad has vanished. No ruins, no walls, no great palace foundations. For centuries, archaeologists have searched for it, combing through the deserts of Iraq, analyzing ancient texts, hunting for any trace of the empire's once glorious capital. But Akkad remains elusive. Some believe it lies beneath the sands near modern-day Baghdad, swallowed by the Tigris River. Others suspect it was built too close to the floodplains and was washed away over time. There are theories that it was deliberately destroyed, its name erased by vengeful enemies. Whatever the reason, Akkad is a ghost, a civilization that shaped history but left behind no trace of itself. But maybe that is fitting. Akkad was always more than just a city. It was an idea. A force. A revolution in how power was wielded and how nations were ruled. Even if we never find its ruins, we still live in its shadow. But could Akkad have survived? Or was its downfall inevitable? History is never a straight line. It is a cycle, one of rise and fall, of creation and destruction. Akkad was the first empire, but it was not the last to collapse. Rome, Byzantium, the Mongols, the Ottomans, all would one day face the same fate. But could Akkad's end have been avoided? The empire's collapse was not just the work of invading armies. It was internal decay. The revolts, the overextension, the exhaustion of resources, all signs of a system that had stretched itself too thin. Could better governance have held it together? Perhaps. A ruler more skilled in diplomacy than war might have found a way to unify the restless city-states. A more sustainable economy might have kept the empire from overtaxing its people into rebellion. But then, there was the climate. The drought that struck Mesopotamia at the end of Akkad's reign was not just a passing hardship, it was a cataclysm. Scientific studies of ancient sediments show that rainfall patterns shifted dramatically. Rivers dried. Crops failed. Famine spread. Even the mightiest empire cannot fight the sky. And that raises a chilling question. If the first empire in human history could not survive climate change, what does that mean for us? We live in a world built on empires, on systems of control, on economies that depend on stability. But what happens when the climate shifts? When the systems we rely on start to crack? Akkad thought it was eternal. So did Rome. So did every great power that followed. But no empire is eternal. Akkad was the first, but not the last. If history's greatest empire could fall, what does that mean for our world today? Could Akkad have survived if they had adapted their governance? Do you think climate change was the real reason for Akkad's fall, or was it human failure? If modern civilizations faced a disaster like Akkad, would we survive, or would we collapse just like they did? If you've made it this far, you are now part of this story. Akkad may have fallen, but its memory survives, because of those who choose to remember. If you want more history like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Because the past is never truly gone, it just waits to be uncovered.